Fortunately, we have somebody here with us who's the real thing, and that is our friend Craig, the Obamacare expert, Craig Gottwals, whose website is craiggottwals.com. You hear him on Armstrong and Getty frequently. Thank you so much for joining us, Craig.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning to you.
So what? Now, it's been another day, if I guess right. Today's Tuesday, right?
Right.
Which means that Obamacare has changed probably since we last spoke in all sorts of different ways. What's the newest thing?
Yeah, I've gotten accustomed to deciding that every morning I need to wake up and look at the blog posts of the various administrative agencies to determine what the new law is.
It's legislation by press conference.
Yeah, by blog post. Exactly, by press. It's a day-to-day knee-jerk reaction. They want to win the news cycle. They don't. They're at this point. I think the smartest people at the highest levels know that this thing is going to fail probably spectacularly, and now it's just a matter of maybe getting through the next election without that having blown up in their face.
Well, they've already put off one of the deadlines to after the next November election, right? They've imposed one of these deadlines for December instead, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a few of those actually, but I think the one you might be referring to would be the open enrollment deadline, so that almost any actuary you talk to is going to say, look, these plans that you're going to be renewing in the Obamacare exchanges are going to be really expensive, much more expensive than they are this year because the risk profiles in the pools are so much worse. So the administration, ever creatively, said, we're going to give people as much time as possible to sign up next year. We saw that this year's sign up was rocky, so we want to make next year's nice and smooth. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and move everything back a month next year, which conveniently happened to be right after the election, so that the most people will not see their Obamacare premiums prior to the midterm elections. It was very convenient.
Yeah.
But I think we wanted to talk a little bit about...
I did. I want to talk about this Oklahoma thing that you've got in front of you. Because this is a case that a lot of people have not really been following because it's not as sexy as some of the constitutional arguments. But there's a case going on right now, not only in Oklahoma, but in several other states that are challenging how Obamacare is being rolled out as being a violation of the statute itself. And this really has a lot of potential. Why don't you tell people about that?
Yeah. You did a great job yesterday talking about the constitutional issues, and you got to bring in us, penny loafer Kmart lawyers to talk about the administrative and the technical side of it. So
guys who actually have bills to pay.
I'm happy to do that for you. This case has been written about most extensively at the Cato Institute. They've done a great job. Michael Cannon has followed it every step of the way. And the case that's in the federal, that was actually just heard on December 3rd, I believe it was, in the federal circuit court in D.C., was... it's called Halbig versus Sebelius. And it on my blog, when you get there, you can actually, there's a tag called Oklahoma versus Obamacare because Oklahoma was the first state to make this claim.
Right.
But the claim itself is a bit of a technical one. In essence, the statute says subsidies are to be available to the citizens of people in state exchanges.
And subsidies are where the feds come and give you money to help you buy your insurance policy.
Yes, most Americans, in fact, just over 50% of Americans who are below 4 times the federal poverty level, which is roughly $94,000 for a family of 4. If you are in that bucket, which is most Americans, you will get subsidies to buy your Obamacare in a state-run exchange. Now, the statute specifically uses the word state-run exchange. It doesn't say state or federal exchange. One of the nuances of the statute is all of the states were given an opportunity, a choice, to open their own Obamacare exchange. If the states didn't open their exchange, the federal government had to come in and say, well, we will open the exchange for you and operate it in your state.
Right.
And this was done to avoid the commandeering claim that the federal government can't just force the state to open an exchange. It has to dangle a carrot, a little doggy treat, if you will.
Right.
Well, it turns out that when you get into the legislative history of how this was written, and on my blog, you can even see Max Baucus answering a question from another senator in a Senate hearing where they basically said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make the subsidies only available in the state exchanges because we believe that dangling those subsidy dollars in front of the states will be the inducement that the state needs to actually
And there was
open.
A lot of reason to think that at the time.
Absolutely.
Because what happened was Obamacare was so unpopular that it swept a lot of states into having Republican governors and Republican legislatures. But at that time, there was a lot of reason for Congress to think that the states would go along with Obamacare.
Yeah, the thought at the time was, from Max Baucus and other people who wrote the law and promoted the law, was that of course these states, now that we're moving into this and now that we're going to have this, they're not going to turn down all these federal dollars.
Right, but then they did.
34 states did, in fact, turn down the federal dollars. So those of us who are in the trenches and fighting this thing every day watched very closely, and it actually took about a year and a half for IRS to issue the regulations on how they were going to enforce this provision. And the IRS went ahead and just conveniently said, well, we believe that what was intended here was for the subsidies to be available to the citizens in all 50 states. So we're going to go ahead and allow people to use subsidies to buy their Obamacare plans in all 50 states, irrespective of whether or not the state or the federal government actually opened the exchange. The problem with that is it is contrary to the plain language of the statute that says in a state with a capital S exchange. The statute does in other places say federally facilitated exchanges, but in this provision, it didn't.
Now, this is a theme that I'm always hammering on when I'm on Armstrong Getty or on this show, that these administrative agencies are these out-of-control government entities. They are not answerable to democracy really in any meaningful way. And this is an example of what I'm talking about. A statute gives power to an administrative agency, and then the administrative agency, of course, tries to interpret that statute as broadly as possible to give itself as much power as possible. And really the only way to rein them in is to say, well, what they're doing is going beyond their statutory authority. And that's what you're saying is going on here.
Well, that's exactly what they're doing. And I believe in this case it was clearly politically motivated, because you had this chain of events is transpiring where 34 states weren't opening the exchanges, and those people that were proponents of the law said, oh my God, what are we going to do? Well, let's lean on the IRS to make sure that when they write these particular regulations, they open it up as broad as possible. And that's what they did. They're going to allow the subsidies to be used in all 50 states, whether it's a state-run or federally run exchange. And the legal argument, so again, the state of Oklahoma was the first state to challenge it. I believe Indiana has also tagged on. Halbig is a private employer who's gone ahead. And you say, well, why would a private employer sue on this provision? Well, there's another devil in the details. It's the provision of subsidies to an individual that actually triggers the employer mandate fine back to the employer of $3,000 per employee for not providing health care or providing insufficient health care. So when you follow this to its ultimate ending, what you see is that if you don't have the subsidies, you will not then have an employer fine, and you effectively won't have Obamacare.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to have, if an employer is not going to get fined for providing insufficient health care, what the heck is their motivation to do it other than what it was in the past?
Right.
Just to be a good employer. But the problem is, now that you have Obamacare, an employer has the political cover to say, well, I can drop health care benefits because you have exchanges you can go into now.
Yeah. And in addition to that, based on the Supreme Court's decision saying that the individual mandate is just a tax, it is no longer unlawful to not buy insurance under Obamacare. It's just the trigger of a tax.
Yeah.
Therefore, it is perfectly legal for you to say, no, I'm not going to do it. You should do it. And it's perfectly legal for a lawyer to advise his client not to buy health insurance.
Absolutely. So what we have here now is we're going to have a situation whereby this decision we should have in the month of January at some point, Halbig versus Sebelius. The government's argument is, when the statute specifically says state exchange, the statute really means state or federal exchange or federal government acting in place of the state. So I was thinking about this as I listened to your show yesterday. I thought, well, this is just awesome, because for Obamacare to stand, for it to operate, for it to be functional in a few months, they're going to have to win all these Supreme Court cases. An individual penalty is going to have to be a tax, which we already decided. Like you and your guests yesterday pointed out, in order, if you cut reimbursements so low that nobody actually will treat somebody on Medicare, they're going to have to argue that that's not rationing, right? And in this case, they're going to have to argue that state means state or any other government.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it seems to be par for the course for Obamacare to just make up the law as we go along, because the law didn't say it was a tax to begin with, and the Supreme Court says, surprise, guess what?
No. In fact, Obama himself was out on TV many times saying it's not a tax.
And it's
no new taxes.
And it's the administration's position to this day that it is not a tax, that it is a mandate. Now, they don't say that in their legal briefs, but the president has to this day refused to accept the validity of the Supreme Court's decision holding that it is a tax, and he and his spokesman have consistently said it is not a tax. So
I don't even know what I could say to that.
Yeah.
When I was on with Jack and Joe about a month ago, we joked about the fact that one of my clients who was talking to a covered California agent actually was asked the question over the phone, well, do you think that your employer premiums are too high? In other words, oh yeah, funny, that's the legal standard.
Right.
How do you feel about your premiums?
Right.
So again, we fell out of our chairs on December 19th when the 14th amendment to the law by blog post came forward and said, Obamacare itself will be the hardship that can exempt you from Obamacare.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that is literally true. What the administration has said is that if the insurance policy, that if you've been canceled and you can't get insurance because it's too expensive because of the regulations, therefore that's a hardship that exempts you from having to comply.
Yeah, I pulled the HHS language because people laugh at me when I say this, and it says, if you believe that the plan available are too expensive in your area. But they actually use the word believe. We're now stuck with blog posts asking what you believe.
Yeah, that's amazing.
To get you a legal exemption.
So here's a question that, I mean, everybody knows that Obamacare is a failure. It's an embarrassing disaster, and it's even more embarrassing for those who are too embarrassed to admit that they're embarrassed, which are the administration's most diehard supporters. So, but nevertheless, we often are then asked, well, what would you do instead? What would you do to change the situation, to make things better if Obamacare were erased overnight? And if you could just think of one or two things, what would those things be?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would erase the ridiculous situation we have now where you buy your health insurance premium with pre-tax dollars only if you get it through an employer. But if you go buy it on your own, you have to pay with post-tax dollars. That is a loophole in the system. It's ridiculous. And a lot of people don't understand that dates back to World War II wage freezes. Because we had wage freezes in World War II. You couldn't recruit people with more pay, but what you could do was give them better benefits. And so employers really got into the business of providing prepaid health care, because what we have is really not insurance. We have these low deductible copay plans that are ridiculous. So you have to get rid of the discrimination that's built into the tax code that favors businesses over individuals and allow individuals to purchase.
Just imagine if your employer bought your car insurance. You got your car insurance through your employer, and then there were these other restrictions on purchasing it to such a degree that there was no other practical alternative. I mean, that would be crazy. Everybody would recognize that was crazy.
It's even crazier in healthcare, because in healthcare, people always talk about how we have a third-party payment system, meaning you pay an insurance company who pays a doctor, and so you've got three parties involved in this, and you, the end user, are really not the one paying the bill. You're paying the premium, and it's the insurance company that pays the bill. But it's even not that simple. It's actually a fourth-party payment system, because you have an employer purchase a health insurance premium, reprice it and repackage it to an employee, and then the insurance company goes back to the doctor and negotiates a bill. So you have four parties involved in the transaction, and the end user, the employee in most cases, has no idea what an emergency room visit costs. They just know that if they have a scratchy throat at midnight on a Saturday, they go. So you have to get it back to the market. You have to get it back to the free market. You have to have, if you said two ideas. The second one would be to greatly expand and open up HSAs.
Yes, HSAs are a wonderful alternative that unfortunately Obamacare really short circuits. And well, I'm not optimistic. I think, following my friend Steve Greenhut, I'm pretty pessimistic, but I'll try to remain hopeful about the future. Thank you so much, Craig, for coming in and for your expertise. It's always a pleasure to hear you on Armstrong Getty, and I look forward to hearing you a lot more in 2014. This is Tim Sandefur hosting the Armstrong Getty After Show on Talk.